and good morning. It's good to be with you all this morning. Last week, we took a much needed break from our Story of the Bible series to think about what it means to be thankful during a difficult time. And now we're in the season of Advent, and we're going to be using this season to think about that point in the Bible story that transfers from the Older Testament to the New. This is kind of a transitional period that we find ourselves in, both in terms of the calendar of the church and in terms of the biblical story. Now, the Old Testament narrative has actually taken us as far as it's going to go in terms of history. We have heard stories about the Babylonians, about people returning to the land of Israel, about the Persian Empire, and then the personal accounts and the histories just kind of cut off there, right in the middle of the Persian Empire, and then we pick it up again in the New Testament. And frankly, that's an odd place for the biblical story to stop, because there are a lot of interesting and important things that happen after the Persian period is over. There's this relatively obscure figure from world history named Alexander the Great, who shows up and conquers the Persians. And that has a huge impact on Jewish society, not to mention the world, frankly. And then Alexander's kingdom breaks down, and some of the different successor kingdoms are vying for power. There's even a period of Jewish independence that emerges out of this. But then yet another empire comes in, the Roman Empire, and consumes them. And even as I hear myself going over that, maybe I can understand the wisdom of why the biblical authors stopped where they did. I mean, after you've heard of about two or three empires, you kind of get the point, right? It gets a little repetitive. I'm not saying that they're all the same or that the differences don't matter. There are certainly some empires that are more friendly to the people of God and others that are much less so. But the general story is the same for all of them. One nation emerges as the dominant nation of the world. It kind of takes on this air of invincibility and speaks and acts as though it's going to reign forever. But inevitably, something happens either internally or externally, and the empire comes crumbling down and is replaced by yet another, and then another, and another, and another, and another. And it goes on, honestly, all the way from the time of the Assyrians up to the present day. And honestly, when you look at history through that lens, where we seem to be just caught in this constant loop of empires swapping powers, it can be a little depressing. It seems as though we're not really going anywhere. We're not figuring it out as a human race. But fortunately, that's not what the Bible focuses on. The Bible isn't interested, frankly, in the Alexanders the Greats and the Roman empires that so many people are fixated on, except to the extent that they impact God's story. The Bible focuses on this exiled people, the people of Israel, as they continue to try to figure out what it meant to be God's people in this difficult, looping kind of world. And I would argue that even here, even in this very difficult period of exile, we see progress happening. We see God's people getting closer to living out the mission that God has in mind for them. And specifically, there's development and progress happening in one area, in the area of hope. What they hoped for began to change. Now, you might remember when we spoke about the Babylonian conquest, which just really sets the stage for the end of the Old Testament. It brings us into this period of exile, which is where we leave off in this act in the Bible story. The first reaction was just utter bewilderment. They weren't expecting this. This was disorienting. They didn't know what to believe. They didn't know what to hope for. And that's perfectly understandable. But as time went on, uh, a hope began to emerge in the Jewish communities. And it became stronger and stronger and more central to who they were. It was this idea that God would eventually redeem the Jewish nation, that God would bring the people back and restore them, and that God would do this by honoring the covenant with David and having one of David's descendants emerge as the leader who would usher this in, a figure whom we think of as the Messiah. But when I say that there was development and progress in this period, I don't just mean that more people were coming to believe in the Messiah, but I mean that their idea of what to hope for, of what the Messiah would do, began to transform from a desire for just national independence, freedom from oppression, to a vision of salvation for the entire world. So during the 3 weeks that I'm going to be preaching in Advent, I'm going to be pointing out three different stages that I see in this development. So the first stage is the hope for a messianic judge who would hold the peoples of the world to account, who would step in and stop the oppressors from doing their oppressing, call them out, and set things right. And this is still a hope that we hold on to today. But as the story goes on, inside of exile, we see another emphasis coming to the forefront. And it's this hope for a Messiah who would not only be the light for the path of the Jewish people, but a light to all of the Gentile nations of the world. This beautiful desire, not just for national liberation, but global reconciliation, begins to develop in the context of exile. And then, as the people continue to think about that, we see yet a third piece of this hope develop, where people begin to long for a Messiah who's kind of a spiritual liberator. And I don't mean spiritual in the sense that the physical and political issues are no longer important, but that the idea of the enemy has changed. No longer are they focusing on the oppressing nations as the primary enemies they have to face, but of the powers and principalities of the world around them as the force that we ultimately need the Messiah to liberate us from. And each of these are very important to the Christian story and our understanding of who Jesus of Nazareth is, as you might already have been able to hear from the third reading that we had this morning. Now, that being said, I know that for some of you, this does not sound like the Jewish people were really making progress. Just this development of ideas doesn't sound like much. What does progress in hope actually mean anyway? But what I'd like to insist is that what we see happening is an important development in the Jewish imagination. Not that any of these ideas were brand new. To be honest with you, we see all of these concepts mixed together in some sense at every stage in Jewish thinking. But as the Jewish imagination expands, what God can do with the people of God changes. I mean, when you think about it in terms of anything in world history, whether you're talking about a new technology that develops, or if you're thinking about a new social program, a not-for-profit, something that's created, all of these have to begin with an expansion of the imagination of what is possible and what is good. And that is what God is doing here at this point in the story, expanding the imagination and the hopes and yearnings of the people of God. And frankly, it's something that we still need to be doing today. In fact, it's the reason why Christians set aside time to celebrate Advent every year. Because it's easy over the course of a year to get beat down and discouraged. especially if you have been advocating for change, whether it's at a social level or you've been trying to help people that you know who are struggling, or you yourself are trying to overcome some struggle or sin or issue that you have. It's often slow going and discouraging, and it's easy to just want to lower our hopes, to say, okay, this is too much to ask for or to want or to believe. Maybe we could just settle for this much change or success and be done. But God doesn't want that. God wants us to maintain these high hopes that reflect where God is trying to bring the entire community of the chosen people. And that's hard to do. So, when you've been discouraged, how is that even possible? Well, I'd say that I think the first step in it is to really deeply reflect on our actual faith in God. If we actually believe in a God, not just an idea, kind of a moral principle that we talk about, kind of this mythological understanding, but a real God, if we really believe that the God who created the universe out of nothing is actively paying attention to and caring about and loves human beings, then we also ought to believe that it's at least possible for this God to use that same creatio agnelio power to enter our world and to change it, even the things that we think are impossible to change. We have to maintain this faith in order to have the hope that God could actually do something. Now, it's quite possible to say, I can't even begin to imagine what that is or what that looks like. That's fine. But we just have to believe in the possibility that God could, and indeed, as the prophets proclaim, God will at some point step in and intervene and change things. And in fact, the prophets developed a term for the moment when they believed this would happen. They thought that there was going to be a divine moment when God would come in and do the impossible. And the language that they used to describe this was to talk about the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord. This was the day, this was the moment, the time when everything that we thought was impossible to change changes. When the God who has been watching us for so long finally intervenes and makes things right. Now, this is a concept that's important for many of the prophets, but perhaps the figure who develops it the most is the prophet Joel. And so I want to take a look at the way that he describes it in chapter 2. So he says, blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is near. Like blackness spread upon the mountains, a great and powerful army comes. Their like has never been from of old, nor will again after them in ages to come. A few things that I want to point out about this quote that we often read during Lent, honestly, is first of all, that last comment that their like has never been from of old, nor will ever be again in the ages to come. Right? God is saying that something is going to change that will break the cycle, the loop that just keeps going and going and going. Right? It's not just going to be more of the same. It's going to be something that you haven't seen before, and it's going to finally set things right forever. But it's hard for us to believe this. It's hard for us to wrap our minds around this, which is why there's this kind of dramatic call at the beginning. Blow the trumpet in Zion. Sound the alarm. You have to prepare yourselves for this possibility that the day of the Lord is coming. It's near. But then this part that's highlighted here reflects another aspect of this story that perhaps is a little bit less familiar to us, talking about like darkness that spreads upon the mountains. What it's referring to here is like an army that just shows up, and it's just so great, and the smoke that it emits is so strong that you can't even see as well. The world around it is dark. We think, ooh, this this is not a very Mennonite image, right? Of a powerful army showing up to change things. And it's not the only big, strong, even violent image that we have in Joel. We have images of the sun darkening, the moon turning to blood, of earthquakes that shake the earth. And I think the reason that these metaphors are needed is to suggest just how big and fundamental the change is going to be. I mean, the Jews were living in a world that was dominated by powers, by political powers that were far, far, far more powerful than them. They didn't stand a chance at defeating the Babylonians or the Persians or the Romans by any means of their own power. And so the images that they have are one that reminds them that God is even more powerful. God can shake the earth, can darken the sun. God could summon an army that is greater than anything they'd seen. And admittedly, some of these are violent images. But as despite this violent imagery, I think that the point that I want to make is that the focus of the day of the Lord in the book of Joel is not on some grand military conquest. We don't have this image of enemies being slaughtered or of being humiliated or shamed as the central image. No, instead, the central image that we have for the day of the Lord, for what that means, is a day of judgment. It's a picture of a courtroom when all of these oppressors, these enemy nations, are forced to come and sit in court and hear the judgment of the good and true God. Listen to how this is described in Joel chapter 3. It says, "For then, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there. They have divided my land, cast lots for my people, and traded boys for prostitutes, and sold girls for wine, and drunk it down." This is an image of God bringing the people, the nations of the world who seem to be getting away with doing these heinous acts, and forcing them to come and hear judgment about these egregious evils that they had committed on the people of Israel. Now, this, as it turns out, is a very important image, not only for Judaism, but also for Christianity. In fact, we still maintain a belief that history will end with a kind of judgment. That's what this Sunday in the course of Advent is meant to remind us of specifically, that there will be a time when the Messiah, whom we believe to be Jesus Christ, will come and will bring judgment to the earth. But I want to point out a few different components of what this divine courtroom meant, at least in its original context, right? So first, I want us to remember that this was written during a time of oppression. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the focus, that there's a lot of energy around bringing down the oppressors, even of punishing them in ways that make us feel uncomfortable, right? So we heard some of this from the passage that Joyce read in Isaiah earlier. It starts with this beautiful stuff about a shoot coming from Jesse, and then it goes on and says, "He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide by what his eyes hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth." And then it goes on, "He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked." Again, this is not language that I'm comfortable with, this idea of God punishing or killing the wicked, but from the perspective of oppressed peoples. What this meant is that the Messiah would rid them of that which has haunted them, would bring down the oppressors. And I think a significant thing to observe, even from passages like that, is that the way that it describes this kind of violent act is that Christ or the Messiah would do it with the words of his mouth, with judgment. It's not using violence or force, but it's as though the judgments themselves somehow take down and stop the wicked. Now, I want to note that it's not the reason that we have this was not just to make the wicked suffer. It's not this pleasure that the people took of seeing God's enemies destroyed, but it's in order to address the injustices that they perpetuated so that God could actually reshape society into something just and good. In order for this to happen, the oppressors, the oppression, I should say, first had to be eliminated. And Isaiah makes this clear later in the book of Isaiah, in chapter 16, when he says, "When the oppressor is no more, and destruction has ceased, and marauders have vanished from the land, then a throne shall be established in steadfast love in the tent of David, and on it shall sit in faithfulness a ruler who seeks justice and is swift to do what is right." So the reason that people can celebrate Judgment Day, which always seemed like a strange thing to me when I was growing up. Judgment Day was not something that I saw as a positive image, right? And yet we find the New Testament urging it on, saying, "Come quickly, O Lord." It's not because we want to see people judged or suffer, but because we need to remove these evils and these oppressions in order for a society that is just and loving and good to be able to stand. There's no way to get to that place without fundamentally shaking things up the way that they are. Now, these ideas, these are things that we've already discussed before in this series, and they actually fit pretty well with modern understandings of restorative justice, right? That we need to stop oppression, to call out those who are doing evil in order that we can establish good and that which is good. But there's another aspect of Judgment Day which does not fit as well into our modern understandings. There's a component of it that I think we need to reckon with, and which I think is very important, which is something that actually cannot be adequately provided even in the best justice systems in the world that we currently have. And that's an element of proclamation. Judgment Day is the day when God will proclaim that which is good, will condemn that which is evil, will name and identify guilt, and at appropriate time declare innocence. And in the biblical story, this seems to be as important as the resulting justice that comes out of it. Now, why? Why is it so important that this big public justice or announcement is made? Well, let me give you an example of a situation in which this doesn't happen in our world to see if it highlights it, right? So, I want you to imagine, it's not hard to imagine, maybe you can think of an example of a situation in which you have a big, powerful corporation or perhaps a powerful individual who has a lot of wealth and power and who has been wronging people, right? There have been maybe an individual family or household that has just been horribly mistreated by this far more powerful party. All right. And the individual, the victim, decides that they're going to take it to court. And so they find a lawyer and they file a lawsuit and they begin challenging this far more powerful party for what they've done wrong. And as it turns out, they seem to be fairly successful. The other side has to hire attorneys, and then they have to start paying these attorneys to deal with the court fees. And then there's some pressure that comes down on the offending person or party and says, you really shouldn't have done this. This is the kind of stuff that gets us in trouble. But ultimately, the lawyers get together and they come to an agreement, a settlement, right? And so in this settlement, it might be that the offending party has to pay a large amount of damages to the victims, and that this money helps them to be able to heal or recover. And that this puts pressure on the offending party to make changes so that this won't happen again. All of that's good, right? But as a part of this settlement, the offending party never has to acknowledge guilt. I didn't do anything wrong. I just settled. Their record is clear. They can just kind of move past it once they pay the fines as if nothing happened. Am I the only person who is bothered by this? I mean, sure, there was a consequence and there's punishment, but we have this yearning for proclamation. It needs to be said in some clear and profound way that what they did was wrong. It's deeply troubling to think that people could get away with it, even in their own minds. And frankly, that's not just something that happens when people settle. Even when they're declared guilty in court, the person who's accused can shrug it off, can even laugh about it. It doesn't have the kind of satisfaction that we yearn for of an ultimate proclamation of right and wrong. But this is what the Bible promises that God will, in fact, do. There is this, in this third element of judgment, God requires the offending party to come before him and hear this judgment of what they've done wrong. Take, for example, how this is described in Ezekiel with a specific group of people, the Sidonians, right? In Ezekiel, it says, "Thus the word of the Lord came to me. Mortal, set your face towards Sidon and prophesy against it and say, 'Thus says the Lord God, I am against you, O Sidon, and I will gain glory in your midst. They shall know that I am the Lord when I execute judgments in it and manifest my holiness in it,'" right? When God's speaking about getting glory in Sidon, even if Sidon is not wanting to worship God or is on the side of the offending party, it means that God will make it undeniable so that even the Sidonians have to acknowledge it, that what they had done was wrong and that God demands justice. And this is true for big public wrongs as much as it is for small private wrongs. There's this yearning that God will set things right. Now, I've said in the past, and I believe this, that this is not typically how God operates. That when God is in the world today, God doesn't shove our wrongness in our face, but God whispers gently and subtly, calling us to repent and to accept a better way. But this will not always be the case. The prophets make it clear that there will be a day in which God's judgments will be loud and unavoidable. As Joel says at the end of his book, the Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shake. At that point, you can't close your ears. You can't avoid it. God's judgment will be known and things will be set right. Now, as we think about this, it might occur to you that this judgment, which sounds so promising from one perspective, that, oh, yes, those who have done evil will be forced to see it and deal with it, it kind of cuts both ways, right? Like that also means that each of us will be forced to see and confront and deal with the evil, the unjust, the cruel and harmful things that we have done. And it's not as though the biblical authors were unaware of this. Joel actually says at one point in the narrative, truly the day of the Lord is great, terrible indeed. Who can endure it? Right? So there's this kind of strange combination of recognizing that it is both great and terrible and terrifying, the thought that God is going to judge in this way. And fortunately, there's more to be said in the biblical story about this judgment. There's a whole nother chapter that has yet to be written about mercy, God's mercy that triumphs over judgment. But we're not there quite yet. So I'm just going to ask you to pause on that one. But even in this concept of mercy triumphing, it doesn't eliminate judgment, it goes through it. And I think that at some level, there's even a desire among evildoers, among all of us, frankly, to hear this judgment. If you've been carrying the burden of lies your whole life, it's distressing but often liberating to have the truth proclaimed. If you have been doing evil and getting away with it your whole life, then a judgment suggests that no, you know what? Your actions actually mattered. There is a moral authority in the universe. And there's a sense in which that is satisfying in the same extent to which it's terrifying. And so, this concept of the day of the Lord, the day of judgment, it emerges among this oppressed people in exile as a hope that God will set things right. And it carries on right into the New Testament. Jesus reinforces it, saying that he will be the one who will come as the Son of Man to usher this judgment on. And so, as we think about where we are in the world today, we can both look forward to and be a little bit nervous about this at the same time. But we remember that God is good, and we put ourselves, our hope, in the one who will come as the Messianic judge and who will set things right.